Welcome, everybody, to the European Gas Market Outlook 2026, the Europe part of the forum here. I'm delighted to be joined by Anne-Sophie Corbeau, Global Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Anne-Sophie, thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to be focusing on the European gas market and talking about that in the context of Russia, Ukraine, and other dynamics which may be influencing that in the year ahead.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Well, great to see you. I'd like to start with a sort of assumption, however unlikely we might believe it to be, which is that we will see an end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That doesn't look likely at all in the immediate sense. But let's just make that assumption as economists, even not just as politicians, and say that we have a peace deal that will come about this year. Would that have any practical impact on Europe's gas intake, where it's taking its gas from, or have we settled in to a pattern that you think would be irreversible?
It's a very good question. I think we are very simply too far gone. There have been the invasion of Ukraine, the constant attacks, but also Russia has basically been testing the European defense with planes and drones. So the trust is really broken. Also, it's important to remember that Europe last year imported about 35 BCM of Russian gas, 20 BCM of LNG, 15 BCM roughly of pipeline gas, which is also going to some non-EU countries such as Serbia. So the current plan of Europe to phase out Russian gas will be in different steps, with the most important ones being at the end of this year, Russian LNG stops, and then Russian pipeline gas stops on the 30th of September 2027. So if there was a peace agreement, I think the most important impact would be potentially on Russian pipeline gas, which would remain. But that would be in 2027, not really in 2026. I mean, the volumes which are going to be impacted in 2026 about the sanctions, about the phase-out deal, are really small, especially for pipeline gas.
Okay, so not a lot of change this year regardless, but we'll see those changes come into effect anyway, as planned in 2027. What about prices? I mean, we saw LNG, supported quite well by Europe last year in terms of global LNG prices. Demand was, relatively robust versus Asia, which was relatively speaking muted for that region. But again, what would a Russia-Ukraine deal do to gas prices, would you say? I mean, presumably they would head lower, but where are the dynamics, do you think, on that front?
What is very interesting is that since the beginning of the winter in Europe, we've actually seen prices dropping. I mean, it's remarkable that we are below 30 euro per megawatt hour, even though storage is quite low. I mean, we are right now about 10% lower than last year. And I'm looking at the window because it's snowing in Paris, which is quite exceptional. So I am more worried about the weather, which is actually coming from Russia, than about Russian pipeline gas right now. But there is one important thing that we should not forget about a potential peace agreement. This is that if the US is involved, and if there is a global peace agreement, then maybe some sanctions on Russian LNG would be removed. And that could bring back the smaller LNG plants which have been sanctioned by the Biden administration, so Portovaya and Vitsopt, and also facilitate Arctic LNG 2, because the plant is sanctioned. It's right now smuggling some LNG to China, but officially it's sanctioned, and they have not had access to the ARC-7 LNG cargoes, which are very essential for the good operation. So that is something, the logistic part is something that people should be looking at. Should there be a potential peace agreement? But as I said, I mean, for Europe, right now, the main question is about how cold the weather is going to be, and how strong our demand is going to be, and how strong the storage refilling needs are going to be in April. This is a big question.
Okay, absolutely. And of course, we saw Europe have to compete with China. I remember when the gas prices exploded post Russia-Ukraine initially, and Europe was really caught, wasn't it? Asia did even worse, but they were all exposed very much to the spike in prices. Everything then settled down. Of course, what then materialized was more American LNG being taken into Europe. That has only increased, and of course, the agenda of the US is, with its energy dominance agenda, is to maximize those LNG exports even more into Europe and anywhere else which will take them. How vulnerable do you think Europe has become to that dependency? It was dependent on Russian LNG and gas more before the Ukraine war, but it's replaced that with dependency on the US. Would you agree? And
Yes, I mean, to a certain
given
extent,
geopolitics, that's a tricky situation, isn't it?
it's an interesting situation. I mean, it's true that last year, EU LNG imports have been at a record level, 145 BCM. I mean, we were at roughly 80 BCM in 2021. So you can see we have almost doubled. And US LNG was a bit more than 50% of that. It was 80 BCM. So it's an increased dependency. We are not at a level where US LNG has completely replaced Russian pipeline gas and Russian gas in general, but we have increased our dependency. Now, it makes us indeed more vulnerable to whatever is happening on global LNG market. I mean, should something happen in Asia, there
Yeah,
would be competition for LNG. But where this is interesting is that both last year and in 2022, the role of China was actually very important because LNG imports dropped in China.
yeah,
And this has actually helped Europe quite substantially in both years. I think if we were not in such a situation, both in 2022 and in 2025, the prices would be at a completely different levels. Now, I mean, the Chinese LNG imports have dropped last year. I think they are
yeah.
bound to rebound this year.
Mm.
And especially because prices are moving down, then of course, Asian LNG demand is expected to rebound as well. So what most analysts expect is that most of the additional LNG which is coming to the market in 2026, mostly from the US, a little bit from Qatar, depending on when the North Field expansion starts, is going to go to Asia rather than Europe.
Okay, and so where does that leave Europe, though? That's I know you're saying it has a cold winter. It has enough storage, do you think, to sort of, I suppose, fight any shortage that may appear out of that? As you said, Asia's going to rebound. It's been a bit quiet the last year or two. Um, what vulnerability does that leave Europe in?
I think the most important vulnerability would be if we have a cold spell,
Yeah.
say in March, because this is when, yeah, storage would be at much lower levels, of course, but this is also where you have a much lower withdrawal rate because storage levels are at such low levels. And this is a potential issue that we may face. And again, I mean, it's all about weather at the end of the day. And this, if this is coupled with, Dunkelflaute that has plagued us a little bit last winter, then this is even worse. So we would need to attract even more LNG in that case. And that can also lead to a spike in terms of prices, as we have seen, for example, in March 2018.
Okay, I mean, and the LNG market has been relatively, I suppose, tight ish and expected to be this year on the whole in terms of supply versus demand. But we do have a wave of new supply coming on, don't we, at the end of this year and into 27, 28. Again, we don't know where demand is going to go, but could we see a glut? Could we see an oversupplied market, do you think? How do consumers and producers look at that market as we stand at the beginning of 26?
It's an excellent question that nobody is actually managing to answer. There are two narratives. The first one is that because we are facing right now a very tight market, we don't know actually what an unconstrained LNG demand is looking like. So it might very well be that all these volumes are going to be sucked in by Asia, by Europe, etc. And in the end, okay, we have lower prices, but the volumes are actually absorbed. The other one is that there is so much LNG which is coming that there is no way the market is going to absorb that. And the rhetoric that can actually move or displace coal-fired generation in Asia is actually wrong because the prices are never going to be low enough to displace existing coal-fired generation. So we are between those two narratives right now. And of course, it's impacted a lot by the geopolitics because, well, Europe is going to stop importing Russian gas and Russian pipeline gas and Russian LNG. China has stopped importing US LNG. So it's all complicated.
Absolutely. What about, I mean, let's talk about sort of, as again, with that sort of new LNG supply that's coming on board and traditional, so the strongest players in the market, you've got Qatar versus US at the moment, who seem to be sort of competing on that front. You've obviously got Canada as well, but, you know, Qatar, US, the two biggest sort of LNG suppliers. Again, I mean, bearing in mind that we have a lot of these new projects that are reaching FID, etc. Qatar was always so dominant, wasn't it? Had a very comfortable position. It also has its challenges now with the LNG supply into Europe, with the emissions question marks that are being put on that by Europe. That's obviously still being negotiated. But I mean, can those two still have an equal place in the future market of LNG?
Well,
We
I have to
saw a
say
lot of
that Qatar,
Australian LNG close down, for example, a few years ago.
the strategy of Qatar is, one of the big question marks for me because, I mean, we have seen that the existing expansion that is happening this year has been actually postponed. It was supposed to start a little bit earlier. Uh, I, 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 I I can see different scenarios. I mean, either the Qataris are not happy because they have not signed enough long-term contracts, because they are very inflexible in terms of the delivery terms. They want DES terms, not FOB. So maybe, they are going to actually slow down the expansion, or maybe they are going to actually take an active role, either by actively marketing their LNG to especially the Asian market and trying to help in terms of
Mm.
managing the infrastructure, developing LNG import terminals, pipeline, gas power plant, or they will try to undercut US LNG. And let's not forget that if there is one last man standing in the gas and LNG world, this is Qatar, because they are by far the lowest gas producer.
Absolutely. And of course, they have, less per capita cost, let's say. So they're in a very advantageous position. Anne-Sophie Corbeau, Global Research Scholar Center on Global Energy Policy. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Global Energy Outlook Forum. It's been great to have your insights.
Thank you so much for inviting me again.
All the best. I'm delighted to have joining us for this session in Europe, Christof Rühl, Senior Research Scholar Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University, to get his take on the global macroeconomic outlook for this year and beyond, indeed. Christof, thanks so much for joining us. We want to get your perspective on that in the next 15 minutes. I mean, we want to look forward all of the time in our conversation, but just to look back 5 years, we had COVID, we've had the Russia-Ukraine disruption, we've had the Trump tariffs in the last year, and now my question to you is, as we enter sort of 2026, are we sort of entering a period of more predictable, sort of, I suppose, structural, lower for longer global growth? Do we have something a bit more certain, even though we're slowing down? Or is geopolitics, tariffs, macro policy still causing a lot of uncertainty, I suppose, amongst players in the market?
Yeah, good day, and thank you for having me. Certainty is not the kind of key phrase I would hope for 2020. I mean, hope for, yes, but I would bet on for 2026. What we have is a world, as you said, where we come out of what has been called multi-crises, many crises developing in parallel. We also have a world where we, in the very long term, have a very stable picture actually of global economic growth. It's always, if you predict 3+%, then you're always right, basically. But it fluctuates, and what changes enormously is the composition. Sometimes it came from China, sometimes historically it came from Europe or from the US. And so that is one question. Where does it come from? How does it split into regions this time? And then, of course, which sectors drive it? I think if you go forward for 2026, it's not very useful to focus on these big crises in the past because they are unpredictable.
Yeah.
What we can say is that regionally we will have a few changes. One is in the US and in North America in general, we will have the midterms in 2026. And we can bet on a government like Trump's government to do everything they can to have a positive growth picture by that time. The US is in a stable growth situation, and so he has some tailwinds for that purpose. And so we should where I would think that the US grows a bit faster than it historically did. So if the last few years it was more like 3%, so now probably more than 3.5% or so. In Europe,
so just sticking to the US, so what about the inflationary picture for the US? Obviously, we've seen the rates gradually come down, interest rates. Trump is obviously pushing for a couple more at least this year, and he's going to get his way, isn't he? Is that worrying at all in terms of what inflationary impact that could have on the globe, obviously, but the US economy itself?
Yeah, first I should correct myself. It's 2 and going up to 2.5% rather than 3 and 3.5% for next year.
For growth.
But
Okay.
the inflationary impact is one of the biggest. I would group this under risks, and not just US risk, but global risks
Yeah.
in the advanced economies, because all of them have piled up debt burdens, which are in the long term very, very difficult to sustain and will lead to inflation. And then populist governments in particular, like the Trump administration, I think qualifies for that, have a bad track record, because ultimately they always try to push interest rates down below what is warranted by the economy. And ultimately they always run up too much deficits and later debt. And ultimately this always ushers in inflation for them. That's a pattern and won't be different in the US. But I don't think this is a big threat, maybe for the end of 26 after the midterm elections, but before that they will try to contain that and deliver a picture which avoids continuation of this affordability discussion which we had in the US. So if we talk about risks for the US or globally, I would put inflation in the advanced economy as the key risk for 2026.
What about tariffs for the US? What about if Trump continues with his tariff policy? I mean, that we didn't see it impacting, obviously, in terms of, cost of goods coming into America from the tariffs that have been put on to those imports. That doesn't seem to have, maybe it's impacted a few things like raw materials, etc., for manufacturing, but it hasn't hit GDP that badly yet. Should we see that settle in more, if you like, as we go into this year?
So this is an interesting question, because economists got that badly wrong. And the majority of them predicted immediate disaster that didn't come. This doesn't mean it's not in the making, because these things take some time to play themselves out. But we have two things here. One is this an enormous opportunistic government. So if there would be real bottlenecks, they would be probably very quick to try to correct them in order to avoid economic damage to the US. The second, more economically substantial reason is that when you think about it, the inflationary impact of tariffs is not as clear as it's often discussed, because it is essentially like an oil price increase. It's a one-off increase. And if you have a one-off increase, it can feed through the system, and inflation means a continuous price increase. It does not relate to necessarily translate into inflation. It could be just any shift in relative prices, like price of energy going up one time, price of cars going up one time, price of tariff goods going up one time. Usually people expect this to translate into a longer pattern of inflation. It hasn't done so yet, but that might still be in the making. The more interesting impact of these tariffs is in the supply chain. Can there be disruptions? Can there be big dislocations in the economy? That was the second suspicion. For that, we have to wait during the course of 2026 if it happens. It's a little bit early to make that call. But as I said, if it happens, you can bet your hat that they will try to be very fast to correct that and to ease bottlenecks and to apply all sorts of measures to avoid shortages or some individual items becoming very expensive and that dominating the headlines.
Yeah, we saw that in 2025 already, in terms of, the parts that are needed for the tech industry, etc. We still saw those exports come out of Asia towards the US. But another point that's been made
But more importantly, we saw an immediate adjustment.
Exactly. So yeah, and immediate adjustment based on necessity, right, and need. But what about, Christof, the argument being made by some people that, okay, the US tariffs, again, there's been a pause with China. We have to wait again till the end of the year, a bit of a hiatus. Things were adjusted as the year went on in 2025. But to do with the supply chain reshuffling, if you like, in terms of reciprocal tariffs from other countries. So once these do start hitting, if they do hit more into Asia, will we see more sort of tariffs imposed by those recipients of US tariffs on other countries, not just back at the US? Japan, let's say, gets tariffed, it's going to have to do something and tariff its neighbors if it's importing or exporting. Do you see that sort of disruption perhaps beginning this year, where we haven't really seen that happen yet?
Well, so you have to distinguish reciprocal tariffs in the sense of other countries levying tariffs against the US. I don't think are in the making.
Other countries levying against
if-
each other as a result, in defensive mode because of what's been happening to them.
They're not happening if we abstract from trade wars. It's quite possible, of course, that there are reciprocal tariffs in the sense of China versus the US or other big blocs versus the US. What's more of a danger is this deglobalization, which we are seeing to emerging with, Europeans leveling tariffs against China, Japan leveling tariffs against its neighbors. I don't think this has been a big issue so far, and I don't think it is one, because the majority of countries will still follow policies which call for globalization, and the majority of countries has realized that they depend on globalization, and that the US is in an extraordinarily privileged situation because they could, in theory, cut themselves off from the rest of the world and living standards wouldn't collapse. They would suffer a little bit, but they have everything one needs to sustain a continent, including if you add their control over neighboring countries. Europe doesn't have that luxury. Most parts of Asia do not have that luxury. So I would not expect many of them to, in a scenario like the 30s, to resort to these beggar your neighbor policies on a grand scale. I don't think so.
So what does all this mean, Christof, for energy demand as we go into this year? I mean, again, we had the IEA looking at changing its long-term forecasting for peak demand. But given the fact that we've got, China ending the year last year not bad, it's still got its structural issues, but it's going to be doubling down on fiscal expenditure. The outlook for energy demand this year, and I suppose related to that, are prices and price ranges. Would you say we're looking at a steady picture as she goes? Of course, last year we saw prices drop, from the 80s comfortably into the low 60s.
Well, in order to answer that, we have to go back to the beginning, to the regional growth composition. If it goes up in the US, as I said, I would also expect growth to be ticking up higher in Europe based on Germany's big programs of expenditure and a general rearmament movement in these countries, and moderating in China in Asia on the back of sort of slow growth in Asia. That means for energy demand that, at least in the case of oil, demand is going to continue to slow down globally, most likely, except that prices are so low that OECD countries like the US and Europe compensate for the declining demand from big consumers like India and China. In the case of when you go to the sectoral composition, what we will see everywhere is an increase in electricity demand, including in the US for AI, but also in Asia and in China, continuation of these high electricity growth rates we had. That will translate into a regional Asian increase in coal demand, a US increase in coal demand, and a European plus Asian plus US increase in natural gas demand. So I would think what we have is a picture which is not looking that great for oil, which is looking very good for natural gas, and by the way, also nuclear to some extent. It takes more time, and which is mixed but positive for coal.
And I mean, again, is that like the AI, as you said, the AI demand? Of course, AI brings efficiencies and boosts productivity if you're talking about manufacturing, etc. But would you say that at the moment, the balance of being inflationary and sort of positive for energy demand as well in that sense, rather than the opposite, which is, it's going to create efficiencies, and so we're going to be using less energy ultimately. Of course, and how long do you think that trajectory will last in terms of this boost that it's giving to gas demand, for example, and for powering those data centers? I mean, is that something that is going to save, if you like, the energy sector?
I mean, first of all, it's demand for electricity, so it's not demand for all primary fuels. In particular, it's not demand for the most important of all fuels, which is oil.
Yeah.
And secondly,
but for gas,
it's regionally very concentrated, but it may spread if we have energy centers developing everything. And that is very important because it counteracts this tendency to deglobalization. So that's a positive for growth. From an economic viewpoint anyway, if you increase the production of energy for something like AI, that's a positive, not a negative. It might be negative for individual countries, regions, or sectors or companies who have to foot the bill, but for the aggregate, an increase in activities is always positive. So I view it positively. What we have to do when we have these kind of long-term discussions is to take into account of the difference between economic growth and economic growth per capita. because we now have a number of countries, the US among them, China among them, Europe in particular, where the population is aging very rapidly, and where the number of economically active people goes down. And so if we see this kind of slowdown, secular slowdown in economic growth, which we have observed over the last years, and put this in relation with per capita incomes, then the picture doesn't look as bleak, it doesn't look as bad. And in that context, I would think that AI helps to stabilize per capita incomes and probably increases long-term per capita prospects for a decent life, in particular for the large part of people who will retire in the
absolutely.
period.
Christof,
So I wouldn't be too worried about it.
We're running out of time, but I do want to get your opinion on the US's energy dominance sort of policy, that it's not being shy about at all. Of course, we had the events in Venezuela over the weekend, which have been, I suppose you could say there was a big preamble to that. But just generally, the US sort of doing what it wants in terms of controlling the energy that it needs, and the regional dynamics around that, the way it's dealing with Gulf producers and the sort of capital flows that are coming between those two regions as well. I mean, what does this mean, do you think, for global energy prices? Are we seeing a new dynamic emanate from the Trump policy of energy dominance, or will it just come down to the physical barrel at the end of the day and fundamentals?
It goes back to fundamentals, of course. When you look at this triangle between global economy, geopolitics, and global energy, usually energy is at the receiving end. Last time energy really played a very big role in influencing economics and politics globally was the crisis in the 70s, the oil crisis. Shale changed that. The emergence of the energy independence of the US also changed the geopolitical picture and changed the global economy. Trump is merely accelerating that, but he does it very purposefully. And what they did now is that they have, with controlling the entire Western Hemisphere, they control the oil supplies for the Western Hemisphere, so that that there's considerably more leeway now and considerably less need to take account opinions in the rest of the world than there was before. And Trump is accelerating that movement and exploiting it to the fullest, as opposed to his predecessors.
The Don Roe Doctrine, as he calls it. Christof Rühl, Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Outlook Forum. Great to have you.